Frank Morrison had been in Vietnam for exactly 4 hours when he heard the explosion. The blast shook the mess tent, sent coffee cups flying, and made every experienced soldier hit the deck. Frank froze, fork halfway to his mouth, unsure if this was normal or if they were under attack. Then Sergeant Bill Henderson grabbed him by the collar and yanked him toward the bunker, shouting something Frank couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Welcome to Vietnam. His first day wasn't even over, and he was already running for his life. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories Vietnam Years. Before we follow 19-year-old Frank Morrison through his first terrifying day in a war zone, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you want to see how an ordinary Melbourne boy became a combat veteran, hit that subscribe button. Some stories need to be told from the beginning. March 12th, Frank Morrison had imagined this moment for months during training, stepping off the plane in Vietnam, beginning his service, doing his duty like his father Harold had done in New Guinea 26 years earlier. What he hadn't imagined was the smell. Tan Son Nhut Air Base hit him like a physical assault: jet fuel, human waste, rotting vegetation, and something else he couldn't identify but would later learn was the distinctive odor of a country at war. The heat was oppressive, turning his new fatigues dark with sweat before he'd even crossed the tarmac. "Move it, diggers, this isn't a bloody tourist stop." The sergeant herding them off the plane looked ancient, probably 35, with eyes that had seen too much. Frank grabbed his duffel and fell into line with the other replacements, all of them fresh-faced and trying not to look terrified. That's when he saw the body bags. A work detail was loading black rubber bags onto a transport plane, the same plane that had just brought Frank's group in. The bags were lined up neatly, zipped closed, tagged. Frank counted 12 before he forced himself to look away. The bloke next to him, another replacement with red hair and freckles, muttered, "Jesus Christ." "Get used to it," said a passing soldier, barely older than Frank but with mud-caked boots and a 1,000-yard stare. "That's the rotation. You fly in, they fly out. Some of them just fly out earlier than planned." Frank's stomach turned. 4 months of training at Pukapunyal, learning to shoot and march and follow orders, and nobody had mentioned this part. Nobody had mentioned that the same planes that brought you to war took the dead home. By the time they reached Nui Dat, Frank's shirt was soaked through and his water bottle was empty. The base was a sprawl of sandbag bunkers, corrugated tin roofs and red dirt that seemed to coat everything. Right then, listen up. The sergeant who'd been on their plane gathered the replacements in the motor pool. "Welcome to Nui Dat, home of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. You're now part of the finest fighting force in Vietnam, or you will be, if you survive long enough to learn something." He pointed to a board with photos and names. "These are the men we've lost this month: Corporal Davies, Booby Trap, Private Jenkins, Sniper, Lance Corporal Thompson, Mortar Attack. Study their faces, learn from their mistakes. Don't become a photograph." Frank stared at the faces. They all looked so young. One of them couldn't have been more than 18. Frank found himself assigned to 3 platoon, C Company. His platoon sergeant was a lean, weathered man named Bill Henderson, who looked at the replacements like they were a disappointing Christmas present. "Right, who are you?" Henderson demanded, clipboard in hand. "Private Frank Morrison, Sergeant." "Where from?" "Melbourne, Sergeant." "Prerhan. Got a girl back home?" Frank hesitated. "Yes, Sergeant. Margaret. We're heroes get killed, and then some poor Sheila gets a telegram instead of a husband." "Understood?" "Yes, Sergeant." By 1800 hours, Frank had been assigned a bunk, issued ammunition, and given a brief tour of the compound. His bunkmate Tommy Walsh turned out to be a wiry kid from Brisbane with an easy grin and nervous energy. "Don't let Henderson scare you," Walsh said as they walked to the mess tent. "He's actually one of the good ones. Lost his first platoon in '66, only 5 survivors out of 23. Now he's paranoid about keeping everyone alive." "Comforting," Frank muttered. The mess tent was crowded and loud, filled with men who'd learned to enjoy hot food while they could get it. Frank grabbed a tray of something that might have been stew and followed Walsh to a table near the back. "So what made you enlist?" Walsh asked, shoveling food into his mouth. "Dad fought in New Guinea. Kokoda track. Figured it was my turn." "Bloody hell, a true believer. Most of us got conscripted." Walsh leaned closer. "Word of advice, don't mention that dad stuff too loud. Some of the blokes here aren't exactly thrilled to be in country." Frank was about to respond when the explosion hit. The blast came from somewhere near the perimeter, a deep, earth-shaking boom that made the tent poles rattle and sent metal trays clattering to the floor. For a split second, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. "Incoming!" Experienced soldiers dropped their trays and dove under tables. Others sprinted for the exits. Frank sat frozen, fork still in hand, his brain unable to process what was happening. Then someone grabbed his collar, Sergeant Henderson, moving fast for a man his age, and physically dragged Frank out of his seat. Bunker. Now. Frank's legs finally worked. He ran, following Henderson and a stream of other soldiers toward the nearest bunker. Another explosion, closer this time, sent dirt and debris raining down. Someone was screaming orders, but Frank couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. The bunker was a sandbagged hole in the ground, already crowded with soldiers grabbing weapons and equipment. Henderson shoved Frank inside and immediately started organizing the chaos. Morrison, rifle. Frank realized he'd left his rifle in his bunk. His hands were empty. Henderson thrust an SLR at him. Someone else's, but you'll give it back if we live. Chamber around. Safety off. If something comes through that entrance that isn't Australian, you shoot it. Understood. Frank's hands shook as he worked the bolt. More explosions. A rapid series that walked across the compound. Frank could hear fragments pinging off the metal roofing, the shouts of men scrambling to positions. Walsh appeared at the bunker entrance, rifle in hand. Henderson, looks like mortars from the tree line, 300 meters northwest. No ground assault yet. Right. How many tubes? Artillery thinks 2, maybe 3. Small stuff, 60 millimeter probably. Henderson nodded, then looked at Frank. Morrison, up here. You're on watch with Walsh. Frank climbed to the firing position, heart pounding. From the bunker's firing slit, he could see across the compound. Smoke rising, soldiers moving in controlled patterns, and in the distance, the tree line where someone was trying to kill him. See that? Walsh pointed. Watch the trees. Sometimes you can see the flash when they fire. Frank strained his eyes, scanning the dense jungle. Nothing, just green chaos and, there, a brief flash of orange-red barely visible through the foliage. I see it, Frank shouted. Good eyes, rookie. Walsh was already on the radio, calling in the position. Australian artillery answered 30 seconds later with a thunderous roar. Heavy shells screamed overhead and detonated in the tree line. The mortar fire stopped immediately, and that, Henderson said calmly, is why you don't fuck with Australian artillery. That night, lying in his bunk while Walsh snored softly, Frank pulled out paper and pen. The mess tent had been cleaned up, dinner had been served late, and life at Nui Dat had returned to what passed for normal. But Frank couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that flash in the tree line, heard the mortars, felt Henderson's hand grabbing his collar. So he wrote, Dear Margaret, I arrived safely in Vietnam today. The journey was long, but we made it without incident. The base is well defended, and the fellows are professional and friendly. The weather is hot, much hotter than Melbourne, but I'm adjusting. The food is adequate, and we have everything we need. Sergeant Henderson, my platoon leader, is an experienced soldier who's taking good care of us new arrivals. I think about you constantly. Your photograph is on my bunk, and it reminds me why I'm here and what I'm fighting for. A free world where we can get married, raise children, and live in peace. Don't worry about me. I'm being careful and following all the rules. I'll write every week, I promise. All my love, Frank. He folded the letter, sealed it, and stared at the ceiling. Every word was technically true, but the whole truth, the body bags, the mortars, Private Cooper's death, that would stay here. Walsh stirred in his bunk. Can't sleep either? First day jitters, I guess. Gets easier. Sort of. You learn to sleep through the noise, eat the food, write the letters. You become a soldier instead of a bloke playing soldier. How long did it take you? Walsh was quiet for a moment. About 4 hours. When we took mortar fire my first day. Frank almost laughed, but it came out as something closer to a sob. Same. Welcome to the shit, Morrison. Try to keep your head down and your sense of humor up. It's the only way through. 56 years later, an elderly Frank Morrison would sit in his kitchen in Prairie, talking to his neighbor Mrs. Chen, about inherited trauma and the weight of memory. He would tell her about his first day in Vietnam, about freezing in the mess tent, about learning that war wasn't what he'd imagined. But what he wouldn't tell her was what he'd thought in that bunker while mortars fell. He'd thought, I want to go home, not to Australia. Home to being 19 and naive. Home to not understanding what his father's silences meant. Home to thinking war was about honor and duty instead of mortars and body bags. But there was no going home. You could only go forward, one terrifying day at a time. Private Frank Morrison's war had begun, and it wouldn't truly end for another 56 years.